Welcome to this, that announcement. Okay, so good morning again, everyone. Welcome to this virtual side event at the 11th Africa Regional Forum on Sustainable Development. Our session today is titled Enhancing SMEs Integration in Regional Value and Supply Chains for Job Creation and Sustainable Growth in African Vulnerable Countries. My name is Numezanar Miali for short. I am a project coordinator at the Africa section of the Division for Africa, Least Developed Countries and Special Programs at UNCTAD. I have the pleasure of introducing today's session. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping notes. For all the participants, please keep your microphones muted unless you are given the floor to speak. Online participants are encouraged to submit their question via the Zoom Q&A box or the chat box. Our Q&A session will follow the panel discussion. And at last, as you heard, the session is being recorded. So we will begin with the opening remarks delivered by Mr. Junior Davis, Director of the Policy Analysis and Research Branch at the Division for Africa, Least Developed Country and Special Programs of UNCTAD. His remark will set the tone and underline the significance of today's discussion. At this point, I would like to warmly invite Mr. Davis to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Miali. Distinguished Excellencies, panelists, and esteemed moderator, representatives from the Uganda Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Cooperatives, colleagues from the UN Resident Coordinator Office in Uganda, and UNCTAD, and all our participants joining us today, good afternoon and welcome. I'm honored to be at this important side event of the 11th Africa Regional Forum on Sustainable Development. Our theme today, enhancing SME integration in regional value and supply chains for job creation and sustainable growth in African vulnerable economies, is incredibly timely. We are meeting during a challenging time for the global economy. Trade is unpredictable, with impacts from tariffs and geopolitical shifts hitting Africa hard. In 2023, foreign direct investment in the continent fell by 3%. Even more concerning, official development assistance, which we expected to increase, actually declined by over 4% in 2022, despite record highs in global flows. Additionally, 46% of African countries now have debt levels greater than 60% of their GDP, and many rely heavily on a narrow range of export commodities and a few key trading partners. This situation increases Africa's economic, social, and environmental vulnerabilities. Yet within these challenges, there are significant opportunities. The African Continental Free Trade Area offers us a pathway to resilience and economic diversification. Intra-African exports tend to have a larger share of processed and semi-processed goods compared to exports outside the continent. These are the foundations for sustainable growth. However, we must also remember that intra-African trade currently makes up only 16% of total trade. By comparison, in Europe, this figure is 68%, and in Asia is 59%. Furthermore, small and medium-sized enterprises, which are the backbone of Africa's private sector, are not fully engaging in these value chains. So why is that? Mainly because the barriers are systemic. We face infrastructure deficits, particularly in energy and transport. There's also a significant financing gap for SMEs exceeding $400 billion each year. Inconsistent regulatory environments and non-tariff barriers add an average cost burden of approximately 292% to intra-African trade. These are not just numbers. These are real constraints, stifling innovation and leaving millions without opportunity. But we have viable solutions, and I'm expecting some of those will be discussed today. The AfCFTA is more than a trade agreement. It represents a comprehensive development framework. If fully implemented, it could boost intra-African freight by 28% and maritime demand by 62%. To unlock these benefits, we need focused policy interventions. First, we must speed up the implementation of the AfCFTA. This necessitates a unified regulatory body to harmonize customs and quality control measures while enforcing dispute mechanisms and launching the AfCFTA's digital trade protocol. Second, we need to enhance our regional transport and digital infrastructure. We must attract both foreign and domestic investments in infrastructure development, utilizing blended finance, fintech, and risk-sharing mechanisms to create new investment opportunities and promote financial inclusion. Third, we need to empower African investors. In 2023, they financed up to 20% of international projects on the continent. Mobilizing African capital institutional funds, such as central banks and pension funds, will be crucial for driving sustainable investment. And finally, unlocking the potential of small to medium-sized enterprises in regional value chains is not just an economic objective. It is essential for the continent's development. With inclusive, science-based, and evidence-driven strategies, we can transform Africa's vulnerabilities into resilience and turn growth into shared prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, we must work together to reshape our development and structural transformation models across the continent. We need to create innovative, inclusive, and sustainable policies that effectively respond to our challenges. This event is a unique opportunity for us to share our experiences, strengthen partnerships, and lay the groundwork for a new generation of public policies that are agile, equitable, and better aligned with the sustainable development aspirations of African nations. In closing, I want to thank the co-organizers for making this event possible, and I look forward to the fruitful discussions and insights that will emerge today. Thank you for your attention. Over to you, Nyali.
Many thanks, Junior. Let us now move to our thematic presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Habiba Ben Barka, Chief of the African Section at UNCTAD. She will present on unlocking African SMEs trade potential through building stronger resilience. Her presentation will help set the foundation of today's discussion and give us data-driven context for our panel discussion. Mrs. Ben Barka, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mieli. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're connecting from. And again, welcome to this side event. I'll briefly present the findings of our latest Africa Economic Development in Africa report that was published in February 2025, but looked at the dynamics of the polycrisis on African economies from 2002 to 2022. I'll just, if you give me 1 minute to share my screen so I can take you through the presentation. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so like I said, in 2024, for the Economic Development in Africa report, we looked at how do we leverage the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, but also regional trade networks on the continent to help African countries mitigate the market uncertainties that they have been facing for the past few years, and that are coming again recently with the trade wars that have been triggered by the imposition of tariffs by the US. So in the report, we looked at, first of all, trying to understand better the dynamics of shocks that African countries are exposed to. It could be external shocks, but also domestic shocks, and looking also at the vulnerabilities to respond to some of those shocks. So we came up with a framework that looked at this interconnectivity of the exposure to shocks, but also the vulnerability to the same shocks. So in chapter 1, we examined this high exposure to the African high exposure to the global polycrisis. And we looked specifically at 6 domains: economic vulnerability, political, economic instability, political upheaval, climate change, technological disruption, climate change impact, and also social and demographic dynamics. As many of you know, African countries are highly vulnerable to many aspects across those 6 domains, and the vulnerability to those 6 domains heighten the exposure to global shocks. And in recent episode of global crisis, from the 2008 financial crisis to the mineral mining commodity booms, fluctuation, but also the COVID-19 pandemic, the geopolitical tension between global leading countries. We've seen that African countries have been really wavering some of those uncertainties politically, but also economically. And those are mostly due to some of the vulnerability given the high reliance on natural resources, the high levels of debt, the increasing political instability that we see across the continent that are persisting in specific regions of the continent, and also the limited infrastructure regarding transport, energy, and information and communication technologies, and also the digital transformation gaps. We've seen in the past days on the news in Kigali, there has been an AI summit related to Africa, and those are some of the transformation gaps that we also highlight in the report, and we are pleased to see that there are policies and commitment, political will at the global level, but also within the continent to see how do we bridge that gap. So like I mentioned, sorry?
Hi, Aviva, sorry to interrupt you. We can see your screen, but we see the presenter view of the PPT. Are you able to make it full screen for our audience?
Okay, let me try to then share again. Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not very familiar with Zoom. We are used to Teams. And can I ask you whether you can also see the presenters, no, just the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Right now.
So yes, on that, so then we looked at the interconnectivity between the exposure to those across 6 domains of global shocks, but also the vulnerability in terms of economic vulnerability, governance challenges, connectivity deficit, social dynamics, energy challenges with access to energy, and also taking into account the need to go toward energy transition and renewable energy, but also how some countries on the continent have been impacted by climate change. And sorry, let me try to see. Okay, and so just to take you through some of those vulnerability briefly, I'm not going to dive very deep into all 6 domains, but especially looking at 2 key domains that I wanted to highlight from the findings from chapter 1. It's the economic vulnerability, for instance, where we looked at because of the high dependence on commodities export and the weak trade diversification, African countries are highly vulnerable to economic shocks, whether they are domestic, regional, or global. Also, the fact that they have a high debt to GDP ratio that is above the threshold of 60% that has been set by the IMF to a level of sustainability in terms of debt, external debt. You can see that 46 African countries have debt system debt level above that threshold. So this raises the issues in terms of fiscal sustainability. And when you have fiscal unsustainability, it basically lowers your government's ability to mobilize liquidity or to put liquidity at hand to address some of the impact of the global shocks. And also inflationary pressures, especially for export-dependent countries that has been really impacting the financing of many countries when it comes to their sustainable development, and also the ability to respond in a really timely manner to some of the impact of the shocks. And of course, supply chains disruption we've seen in the past years, from COVID 2019 to more recently also the war in Ukraine and other geopolitical dynamics, where supply chain disruption have been impacting a lot African countries that really rely a lot on some of those global supply chains. And then also to take you through some of the findings that we're able to also identify under the vulnerability to energy and climate change risk and global shocks. Is that many African countries are still highly exposed to fuel import price volatility, although many governments are pushing forward for more energy transition and development of renewable energy sources of renewable sources of energy. Countries are still really impacted by those climate vulnerability, although they are not the main emitters of some of those energy related climate impact. There are still most of the impacted countries in the world that have been affected by this risk. So we looked at, given the 6 dimension that we looked at in terms of access, exposure to vulnerability, exposure to shocks, and also the vulnerability to the same shocks, we're able to come to identifying countries that are most exposed to some of those shocks. As you can see from the list, we just highlighted the top 5 exposed countries, but a lot of countries are exposed across all those dimensions. But there are 2 specific dimensions that were quite interesting, where you have significant numbers that are highly exposed to those 3 dimensions. It's economic vulnerability, connectivity vulnerability, but also climate and energy. As you can see in that list, you see mostly countries that are vulnerable, that are commodity dependent countries, and countries also that are mostly low income, poorer countries, meaning that they don't have the necessary fiscal abilities to be able to mitigate some of the shocks or impact of those global disruptions or global shocks that are happening across the 6 domains. So given that we were able to identify 2 key area domains where most African countries are highly vulnerable to economic domain, but also connectivity, then the report takes a deeper dive into understanding the dynamics of why they are highly vulnerable across that economic domain when it comes to how best they can respond to the effect of global shocks, global economic shocks, and try to understand what are the policies that can best be put forward for African countries to really prepare and brace better for the next global shocks that will happen. So under the chapter 2, we looked at economic vulnerability, especially with regard to impact on GDP. As you can see here on the left, on the graph on the left inside of the screen, you have most of the global shock that happened around the world and how African countries have been highly impacted by those, from the commodity price boom to the financial crisis of 2008, the 10-11 Arab Spring, and the commodity price decline of the 2014-15, and also more recently the 2019 COVID. And there you can see that this has been the huge dip in terms of impact on GDP for African countries. But this is not new to all of us. We've been analyzing some of those impacts, but it's interesting to see that across different African groupings, how they were able to react, or how they were affected by some of those global shocks. And that chapter takes a dive deep into those different aspects. Before I get into those specific country groupings, just also to show you how fixed capital formation have been impacted also by those global shocks on the continent. And it's interesting to, in the report, we looked at also how the impact has been on domestic investment, especially state-owned investors, whether they are pension funds, institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds, and how they were impacted by some of those global shocks. And so now to come into the specific risk that African countries have been affected by, we looked at for instance, for commodity-dependent countries, especially those that are highly reliant on the export of fuel. We looked at how impact of fuel prices have been affecting the growth and also the financing, the ability to mobilize financing or the ability to borrow at a reasonable rate without having to add more pressure on the fiscal stability. And we also looked at how countries that are dependent on agricultural export, for instance, how climate change impact or shocks have been affecting those countries. And given that there are some countries on the continent that are not commodity dependent, but rely a lot, for instance, on tourism, on other type of sectors. And we also looked at how, for instance, the COVID-19 has impacted some of those countries. The cases of such as Mauritius and Cabo Verde that are whose economies are highly reliant on tourism sector. We saw that how COVID-19, because of border closure, because of restriction on travel, those countries were highly impacted by some of those global shocks. And then we looked at also deeper into the vulnerability of commodity-dependent economies when it comes to inflation, how inflation volatility has been affecting those countries, and how also in terms of price of commodities, those countries were able to were affected by some of those shocks. I won't take too much time because I know I was told that I have 10 minutes and I have a lot of slides to go. So in chapter 1, we conclude by with the need that is, we need to look at how do we not only continue enhancing macroeconomic stability, but how do we pivot a little bit some of the policy reforms that are required that are necessary for African countries to better mitigate some of those economic vulnerabilities. There are policies in place that have been in place to mitigate some of the past economic shocks, but as you know, the economic shocks are now becoming more polycrisis, in the sense that you have a interconnection of different crises and shocks that are coming at the same time, and it's becoming very difficult for economies, governments, especially African economies, to really react to some of those shocks. And to see how best not to leave them behind, the report is looking at some of the policies that can be tailored to the specific capabilities and need of African governments, so they are able to better address some of those some of the vulnerability to those global economic shocks. And then in chapter 3, we looked at now the connectivity vulnerability. And when we talked about connectivity vulnerability in the report, in this specific publication, is looking at regional connectivity, whether it's transport, whether it's telecommunication, whether it's just value and supply chain connectivity. We looked at whether under the umbrella of regional integration, African countries can better react or respond or address some of those, the impact of some of those global shocks. So under chapter 3, we brought in a new, it's here, sorry, we adapted a net trade network, value-added trade network analysis to the specific African context. This is not a new methodology, but it's the methodology that has not been utilized enough to understand the regional integration dynamic on the continent and how it can be used as a mitigator against some of the global shocks that the country has, that the continent has gone through. So what was interesting is that we realized that when we do a value-added trade network at the global level, which I'm not presenting on this slide, but it's in the report, you can see that African countries play a very really limited role in terms of being a node in that value-added trade network. When we looked at them, and then we try to understand what about if you, at the intra-African level, is there any significant players or significant countries that are maybe holding the network together? And it was interesting to see on the left-hand side graph on the left-hand side of this slide that countries such as South Africa, Djibouti, Zimbabwe, Gambia, are playing some kind of significant role. Basically, they are holding the African network together in the case of South Africa, because it has a very diversified economy. So it's a supplier and also a user of different input that are that are needed in the manufacturing sector on the continent. But in the case of Djibouti, also because of the port of Djibouti that has been used to import and re-export some input that are required in the landlocked countries that are bordering Djibouti. So you can see that Djibouti, for instance, is a significant player in that intra-African network. But what we assess here is that there's still a risk, because if you see, if anything happened to some of those countries that are holding the network together, if there's a shock that impact them, then the full network becomes very fragile. And so we try to understand, okay, if we go at we narrow it down again at a sub-regional level, where you have regional economic communities that are basically set to facilitate intra-African trade, do we see a different narrative? And it was interesting that we looked at the cases of COMESA and ECOWAS and other sub-regional economic groupings to see if we do the same value-added trade network analysis, do we see a more homogeneity about the role of the countries in the network. And you can see, for instance, in the case of COMESA, especially looking at the manufacturing sector, you can see that all members of COMESA are more or less have equal weight in the network. So that means that even if one country gets affected by an external shock or a regional shock, the network will be able to pivot around and tap into the resources, the inputs, or be a supplier through the network using different other countries. So that was quite revealing for us to get that understanding and realize that at a sub-regional level, where you have regional economic communities that have made significant progress in terms of facilitating trade, having policies in place for more value addition trade within the member state, that's then enable us to put forward the need to push forward more regional integration, which will enable African countries basically to strengthen the intra-African trade networks and be able to mitigate better the impact of some of the global shocks that they face, and especially when it comes to trade, productivity, and then also revenue, the revenue that they collect through trade. Despite that, we saw that, okay, it was a good finding, but there are still challenges for all regional economic communities or Africa at the continental scale, especially under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, to be able to achieve that strength in terms of regional trade network. So we try to understand some of the gaps and challenges that they face. And of course, infrastructure is a huge gap, especially given that the chapter is looking at connectivity itself, looking at electricity, transport, ICT. You can see that there has been some interesting progress in ICT, but when it comes to electricity and transport that are critical in some sectors such as agriculture and manufacturing, then we make the call to strengthen investment and also policies that are oriented towards the development and the modernization of the transport and electricity industries on the continent. And we also looked at non-tariff barriers, because if we go towards a full regional integration or a strengthening of regional economic communities, we know that tariff barriers are being addressed under the policies of the trade policies of those communities of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But non-tariff barriers are still significant on the continent, and as you can see, they really heighten the cost of trade on the continent, and which, as we know, it discourages investors. It's kind of impact the cost of productivity itself, and it renders African economies much more vulnerable at the global scale. I won't spend too much time on that one, but the chapter we came to the conclusion that it's important to keep pushing for the need to strengthen regional trade on the continent, and to look at how best we can build up on the experience of the regional economic communities to see how we can scale some of the success stories at the continental level, and see what type of investment would be required to support that vision on infrastructure, but also on productivity, on technology transfer, and also on developing further regional value and supply chains. And after those findings, looking at what are the measures that can be put in place to strengthen Africa's economic resilience and connectivity resilience to better mitigate the impact of the policy crisis. We thought that it might be interesting to look at some of the key actors also that can drive that process. And of course, we know that the policymakers are relevant, but the policymakers alone cannot achieve that without the private sector. And in Chapter 4, we looked at now what has been the impact of all those policy crisis shocks on African businesses, African firms, and how they've been able to continue the transaction, the operation, not only within the domestic market, but also cross-border. So in that chapter, we looked at, so this is just to take, it took us back a little bit to, this was some of the findings from Chapter 1, where we have the top 5 countries that have been built, that have significant resilience across the 6 domains that we have identified. And it's interesting to see that besides Botswana, all those countries are non-commodity dependent countries, but all of them are middle income countries, emerging markets. So it's interesting to see that all those countries have diversified economies, and they have they have the necessary means and facilities to be able to better react to some of the global shocks. And using those 5 countries' cases in the chapter, we then looked at in some of those countries how the private sector has been able to also address the impact of the global shocks. And we dive deeper into the chapter, into the specific case of South African firms, for instance, how they've been able to react to some of the global shocks, how they've been able to keep trading within the continent and utilizing some of the mechanisms that have been put at the disposal by the government of South Africa, but also given their own entrepreneurship capabilities to be able to address some of the shocks of the poly crisis. And so in the chapter, what was interesting is that we are able to identify some of the specific vulnerabilities that African firms face when it comes to not only trading, but also how they impact, how they maneuver or how they navigate through the vulnerabilities that the domestic countries or domestic economies are facing, but also the client economies when they are trying to trade across border. I won't spend too much time on that one, but it was interesting to see some of the the risk, the challenges that they face when it comes to high trade costs, infrastructure deficit, regulatory complexity, inconsistencies of some of the frameworks when they want to operate cross-border, for instance. Sometimes even within the own domestic markets, there has a lot of regulatory complexity and consistency in policy that they are not aware of, or they don't know how best to adjust to. And of course, when we talked about the private sector in Africa, what we have in mind mostly are SMEs, and one of the biggest challenges that they face is financial exclusion. So we looked at then financial exclusion not only to operate within the domestic market, but how to also trade and operate cross-border. And the chapter then looks at also some of the tools, mechanisms that can de-risk the investment or the operation across borders. So we have a long list of some of the specific measures that can be put in place that are not new at the global scale, but they're not well utilized on the continent. Very few countries, for instance, have at the disposal of the private sector, especially the SMEs, derivatives that can enable SMEs or exporting firms from Africa to be able to mitigate some of the cross-border financial transactions. So we make the case to really facilitate some of those financial de-risking mechanisms especially that can be tailored to the African SMEs. In conclusion, in the report, we then looked at how do we enhance better the macroeconomic stability of countries that have been highly affected by the poly-crisis shocks. How do we optimize regional market opportunities? How do we strengthen trade value, regional trade networks among African countries? And how do we best leverage the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to ensure that there's a stronger network that is established on the continent, and Africans are able collectively to better mitigate some of the impact of the poly-crisis shocks? And then we also looked at how do we strengthen institutional organizational settings for cross-border trade, not only for government institutions, but also the private sector. So we make the case to ensure, to push forward the need for African entrepreneurs and businesses to have, to institutionalize de-risking mechanisms, to institutionalize understanding better how the impact of shocks outside the domestic market can impact directly or indirectly their own operation, and how and what are the measures that can be put at the disposal to facilitate this type of de-risking tools. Thank you very much. I think I'll stop here. I hope I haven't passed my 10 minutes.
Many thanks, Habiba, for the insightful presentation. So now that the stage has been set and we've explored the broader context, without further ado, let us move to our panel discussion. But prior to that, let me introduce our moderator, Mr. Mugisha Patrick, Commissioner for Business Development and Quality Assurance at the Uganda Ministry of Trade, Industry and Cooperatives. Patrick, I invite you to please take the floor, briefly introduce our 6 speakers who are all connected now, and then move on to the actual discussion. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miali, and all the audience, the panelists, and also the participants. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. And it's such an honor to be part of this engagement. It was on a short notice, but to my dear panelists, the participants, be at ease. I will deliver accordingly, and I'm so happy and excited to make this work. So we've got a very interesting panel that is quite exposed and experienced, but also the right mix that we had for this engagement to deliver on this topic today. And I thank the 2 presenters who set the floor to make sure that we get the right background and also expose to be able to inform the discussion. So to us, we have Mr. Andrew Mould. Mr. Andrew Mould is the Chief of Regional Integration and the AfCFTA Cluster Sub-Regional Office for East Africa under UNECA. Mr. Andrew Mould, you're most welcome. We have Mr. Fabian Kasi, Managing Director, Centenary Bank, Uganda. Mr. Kasi, you're most welcome. Karibu sana. Then we've got Mr. Kama Salem, Head SME Finance Forum. Mr. Salem, you're most welcome. We've got Mrs. Tamara Egbedi, Co-founder and Director, Pacha Mama Foods. Mrs. Tamara Egbedi, you're most welcome. And finally, we've got Miss Bridget Harrington, CEO and President of Igire Continental Trading Company. Miss Bridget, you're most welcome. Now,
sorry,
we've got only, yes.
We have another speaker, Mr. David Ofosu-Dorte.
Oh, yes, sorry. Apologies, Council. That was an oversight. We've got Council David Ofosu-Dorte, Executive Chairman and Senior Partner, AB and David Africa. Council, you're most welcome, and apologies for that oversight. So we've got the panel of 6, and we have 45 minutes, colleagues. So technically, I'm giving you roughly 6 to 7 minutes to respond to 2 questions only, just 2. So basically, you'll be giving us the top-notch highlights and key learnings that you're going to be able to express to the audience. And so we just really encourage that we be disciplined kindly on the time, and but I'm not so rigid. We can be flexible depending on the situation. And so we'll have Mr. Andrew Mould taking the first shot. Mr. Andrew Mould, the first question to you is, how can regional integration initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, be leveraged to enhance SME participation in regional value chains and drive job creation in Africa? Mr. Andrew, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and good afternoon, colleagues. So yeah, an important question. My answer might surprise you a little bit, but before I get to my answer on the particular question about SMEs' involvement in leveraging the AfCFTA. I just wanted to take up issue with Junior, my old colleague and friend, on one of the comments you made at the beginning. You mentioned the thing about the comparison with Europe, intra-African trade and European trade, and Europe trades at 68% and Africa only trades at 16%. And you may have heard me arguing this before. I feel this is very unfair to a lot of our African member states, and particularly to Uganda, where we're sitting in at the moment, because Uganda, from the central bank's statistics for 2022, 59% of its exports went to the regional market. I think we're very much misled by continental aggregates and averages across the real volume make the intra-African total look very low. But in actual fact, when you come to Eastern Africa, you realize that intra-African trade already has a transcendence, which is far more important than trade with a lot of other partners. And the reason I get a little bit upset about this comparison, which is not just you, Junior, is of course a lot of people that start their statements on this, is because I think it misleads the policy advice that you give really afterwards. You know, that people tend to undervalue the true economic significance of intra-regional trade to the region, to regional players, you know, to the regional economies. So I think that's just one important caveat I'd like to put to start with. And a second point, which is possibly even more controversial, I think, is the premise of the question really about SMEs and their involvement in trade. Now, let me just think about how to frame this so people follow the point and don't misinterpret what I'm trying to say. I'm not sure encouraging SMEs to engage in international trade is always best for them. International trade creates a lot of vulnerabilities. It's costly for firms to do so. And I think we often exaggerate the role of SMEs in African economies. So I did hear earlier the phrase SMEs being the backbone of the African economy. I think if you look into the data carefully, you will see that that's not really the case, that the bulk of SMEs that we talk about, the definition of SMEs is very fluid anyway, but actually the bulk of SMEs tend to be micro firms, possibly 1 or 2 people, certainly under 10 employees. And they also tend to be quite vulnerable economic actors. So a lot of the firms don't have very long survival rates. And in terms of their contribution to GDP, I think it's often mixed up with estimates of informal economy and the like. There was a World Bank study from some years back which suggested the SME contribution to the low-income economies in Africa was actually only about 16%. So they're not exactly the major economic actors if you look at it from the right perspective. Now, that doesn't mean a lot of people don't depend on their employment from SMEs. They do have a very important role to play in regional economies. But I think it's wrong to focus the implementation on the AfCFTA on SMEs' involvement. One interesting piece of data, for example, is if you look at the World Bank enterprise surveys and you compare Asia with Africa, for example, and the tendency of firms to engage in international trade, you will find that 7% of Asian firms engage in international trade in any significant way. In the US, it's approximately 3% of firms. In Africa, it's actually higher than both of those. It's around 9% of small firms, according to World Bank enterprise surveys, engage meaningfully in international trade. So actually, it's not the problem that African small firms don't engage in trade. It's the fact that they don't do it at scale. And there was a very interesting article a few weeks back from The Economist, which made this point very clearly, that the problem is there's a missing middle and a missing large scale firms. So in East Africa, for example, if you look at the ranking of the top 500 companies across the continent, East Africa is definitely underrepresented. And I have a strong feeling, and this is an argument that my friend and colleague Francis Manginian and myself make in our book, Borderless Africa, that we need to really start by concentrating on the firms which already engage in trade at scale. Because there's this supposition, I think, in a lot of discussions that they don't have problems and difficulties doing trade across the continent. And the reality is they very much do. So when you speak with these companies, so I had an interesting discussion some years back with the CEO of Bakresa. He was wanting to import wheat into Rwanda from Zambia, but found he couldn't do so simply because of the cross-border trade costs, which you highlight in your report. And I think those are the people that we need to be addressing, to undo the kind of challenges that the medium to larger companies engaging in the bulk of cross-border trade on the continent are confronting. And thereafter, I believe that SMEs can profit on the back of that because there will be more demands for their goods and services to the larger companies. But without those larger companies, I think the continent is going to have a lot of challenges in terms of really substantially increasing the amount of intra-regional trade.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mould. And maybe just to have Mr. Cassie kind of try to build on some of the issues that you've raised in that first question. Mr. Cassie, given your experience leading Centenary Bank, a key player in Ugandan SME financing, what innovative financial models can African banks adopt to bridge the funding gap for SMEs, integrating into regional value chains under AfCFTA? Really appreciating the fact that financing is the oil, is the key driver to make these things happen. What do you have to say, Mr. Cassie? You have the floor. Mr. Cassie, we can't hear you. Miani, can you help engage Mr. Cassie? We can't hear him.
We can't hear you, although you're not muted.
I think he may need to relog in, I suppose.
Yeah.
Mr. Cassie, kindly relog in, and then we can engage you once again. So in the meantime, if you can text him, send him a text kindly, Miali, then I engage Mr. Kama Salem because of time. Mr. Kama, kindly, how is the SME Finance Forum currently supporting African SMEs to address finance and integrate into regional and global value chains? Could you share any success stories or case studies to inform this scenario? Thank you so much, Mr. Salim. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, and glad to be here. Thank you, Pat, for inviting me. So briefly, let me kind of set the context. SME Finance Forum is a G20-backed platform managed by IFC and the World Bank Group. We are a network of financial services providers and stakeholders. We have nearly 300 members and partners, which cover 190 countries. And basically, the forum leverages global innovation, steers new innovations, and helps transfer best practices. So I think from that standpoint, one of the key things we're trying to do is bring the global best practices to Africa. And I think in that context, nearly 20% of our members are actually in Africa. So I think from that standpoint, it's a key region for us. Even our next annual conference is going to be in South Africa in September this year. Now, I think setting the context of the SMEs in Africa, we recently released our latest MSME finance gap report, which positions the global MSME finance gap at 5.7 trillion, and Africa finance gap is around $331 billion, which is nearly 20% of the aggregate GDP in the region. So there's a large financing gap in the region. And I think from that standpoint, I heard earlier the intra-Africa regional trade is relatively lower. It's almost 1/3 the levels that we see in Europe and Asia. So I think there is definitely a need to ignite the value chains What we are trying to do, I think we have several members from Africa. We have commercial banks like Zenith, Standard, NMB, Equity Bank, Access Bank, EcoBank, Afriland, FNB in South Africa. We have DFIs like in Namibia, in Nigeria, and Flexim Bank. We have fintechs. We have nearly 30 fintechs. And then we have partners like, making finance work for Africa, BASA, which is the African Association, and the Century. So we do work with nearly about 80 players in Africa region in trying to see what can be brought in from global practices and what can be disseminated within the Africa region in terms of best practices in SME finance and in particularly in value chain finance. Now, I think I'll give you some examples that you mentioned. One is that we're working with Alliance for Entrepreneurship in Africa. That's one of our affiliates. We are collaborating on AI-driven data analytics platform for specific sub-regions on basically the value chains that sit within. We're also working alongside EBRD on diagnostic study on integration of Africa regional markets, and with a focus on Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and some Pan-African regional markets. We recently, one of our members, C2FO, which is a global supply chain finance platform, they serve 183,000 SMEs in more than 80 countries. And they represent more than 61 billion in eligible invoices in last year. So IFC and C2FO recently struck a strategic partnership to really stir the value chain financing in Africa. And the first initiative will work to enhance financing for local enterprises in Nigeria. I think that's where we are starting. And I think the objective being that we scale from a local currency perspective, we scale the financing to SMEs in value chain by 10 billion per year. And I think that initiative has just kicked off. We have other members like FMO, which is working on agri and renewable energy sectors. We have Propaco, also our members, because our members are also MDBs and development banks. They're also working on supporting SMEs, particularly in agri, manufacturing, and infrastructure. So I think that's how we are trying to ignite the ecosystem that sits within the SME Finance Forum network, which comprises of banks, fintechs, development finance organizations, NBFIs, microfinance institutions, as well as value chain providers.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So maybe going now to Mrs. Tamara Egbedi, you are running a real case scenario, a business, an agribiz, and picking lessons from what Mr. Salem, Mr. Mould has shared. So how does this fit into your space? And so what lessons can other African agribusinesses, SMEs, learn from your model to participate competitively in regional value chains? And how should agri-SMEs prepare to tap into cross-border markets under the AfCFTA? Because you've done it, you have some key learnings. Now share these lessons. You have the floor, Samara.
Okay, thank you very much. That question is actually double. That's a two question in one. So let me break it down first. I'll just give a very brief background of my business because that will help you to understand the model, my model. So it didn't start off first as a business. It started off more to solve a problem. And it was a problem of malnutrition, which I witnessed personally when I visited my country. I was there and I just met a pregnant woman, and she was very difficult because you never see that in Lagos. You hear about it more in the north. Then it was more in my face. And I also realized that giving donations, which we tend to see, whether internationally or locally, was not a sustainable way of solving this particular problem or waiting for the government to solve it. So I decided to do a research on a sustainable and affordable way to solve this problem. And at the same time, it went beyond children. It went beyond, it went going straight up to pregnant women, and also exceeded to the whole, to people, despite of their ages. So what was key was, first of all, knowing what was existing, what was the existing solution, what's the problem, why is there still a problem despite the so-called solution. And the so-called solution then was RUTF, ready-to-eat therapeutic food, which is imported into Nigeria and given to hospitals. When I spoke to the health practitioners, what you get is that a lot of the times when this product comes, they are very close to expiry date. The cost of the RUTF when they come in is so expensive, even the clearing cost is more expensive than the product. You can see the shipping of it. And sustainably wise, the product will take almost 4 to 5 months. And I said, why? They said, it's peanut butter. You don't expect a child or a woman or anyone to, when they take peanut butter, morning, evening, morning, after 3 days, they're fed up of peanut butter. So how do you use peanut butter all through? And so it wasn't sustainable, and a very fast one, especially when these are products, it's made from products or agricultural products, not in Africa. So that was it. So it was clear that there was a problem, and how can I solve that? And then I had the research, and I use climate resilient crops, meaning that no matter how the weather is, it will survive, made with our own ingredients, making sure that it had a full value system. So my model really is a social impact and value driven. So coming from the small scale local community, something like Andrew said, really hard for SMEs to think they can just scale up without medium and large. Same way with SMEs. Even we cannot scale up without the very little person. So this is where the the small scale farmers, I use local fabricators, and I made sure all the machines were gender friendly. If I couldn't use it, I wouldn't buy it. And then instead of buying trucks for movement, I use the local transport system. And I have a circular system where every waste goes back. So that is my model. And another key one is I was very conscious of the SDG goals. I needed to make sure I'm ticking them off. So when you say zero hunger, and this scaled up because when we started, we just gave it to the Lagos State primary health centers, and they came back and said, in just 2 months, within 4 to 6 weeks, a lot of the children that were severely malnourished got to green. Then the federal government got to hear about it. And this is where collaborations help SMEs to grow. Then the federal government got to hear about it and said, we need you to take up a state. And I fed over 250,000 children every week. And you can imagine there was a 90% increase in kids going to school. Then there was an 80% of the kids' health improving. And then we realized certain villages scaled up in their businesses because the women started expanding their farmlands because then there was a ready supply. So I think the key thing here was also economically advantageous to the country. It was in-house. So I would say when you look at what lessons first is, don't start with a solution. A lot of SMEs tend to, first of all, say, this thing looks good. I think it's first of all, target, is there a problem? And then how do you solve the problem in a sustainable and a long-term way, which is economically inclusive? But another key thing, it must be done with international quality standards. Because you don't move forward if you think local. In everything you do, even when you start thinking of international standards. then there's this buy local mentality, I say. And this is what is causing a lot of the shocks, as the earlier advisor said. It's very weird that there's this mentality of what is foreign is better. And guess what? Due to economic challenges, people are going back. But I think it's more than that. There should be a bit more education into the buy local, but that comes again with your quality. Your quality must match the standards in which they hope to see. And then,
Thank you.
So just one fast one, I would say is be resilient. And because resilience is more important than efficiency. That's the key word.
Thank you so much, Tamara. So I think from your perspective, there are some aspects that you really bring onto the game here is any business, to make it out there, you need to address or solve a real problem in the community. And someone will be willing to pay money for a real solution to a problem. And the aspect of you being able to have a quick buy-in into your government, your federal government, it just highlights that when SMEs have solutions that are aligned to policy issues, there should be an easy way of buy-in in making that. So with that really takes us to Council David Ofosu-Dote. As part of the Afro Champion Initiative, you worked closely with the AU on private sector growth, and your company has advised both governments and businesses. Now, from your experience, what one regulatory change in African countries would have the biggest immediate impact on SME participation in regional value chains? From your perspective, Council, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Before we come to regulatory changes, let's deal briefly with what it is that is already available that we are not taking advantage of. I think, and I share the sentiments of the first speaker regarding how we look at SMEs generally to a large extent. So one of them has to do with the whole idea about guided trade initiative. And the guided trade initiative, if you look at East Africa, for example, where Kenya, as many as 27 countries have participated in it, or if you look at Ghana, where you have 14 countries, or Egypt, 7 countries, these companies who have taken advantage are taking advantage of what is already existing based on the 2021 Ministerial Directive. And I think I would like to encourage more taking advantage of what exists before we look at what is it that doesn't exist. And another one has to do with the Boosting Intra-Africa Trade Protocol, which every country is required to have promoted and integrated all its entire businesses into it, including SMEs, of course. And why I said I share the first speaker's sentiments is that when you look at the export across the continent, SMEs, whether they are involved in exports or not, get more involved if they are involved in the value chain. So even if they are not exporting and the trade is being done by even bigger corporates, SMEs get involved in the value chain. And that's the reason why a policy perspective of boosting intra-Africa trade, which integrates SMEs into the value chain, is very, very necessary. And I think alongside that, what has not happened, and then I will now dovetail into what kind of regulatory changes that we may need. What has not happened is carrying this into national policy and ensuring that at the national policy perspective, we are actually practicalizing on an everyday basis what it is that we have promised to do at the Africa level. And you only do that by translating international protocols into national policy and therefore beginning to, as it were, get SMEs to be able to participate in it in a more practical way. So one of the things that we need to do in terms of policy change is, for example, a reciprocal recognition of standards. Now, you do have that when it comes to harmonization of the recognition under Article 4. But you will find that diverse standards in different countries. I had occasion to work with a client who wanted to export certain items into Cote d'Ivoire. And simply the difference in standards between Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and the Francophone, Anglophone divide was a block as a result of which that export couldn't take place. So if you had situations where countries took advantage of the reciprocal recognition principle and harmonized it in their own local law perspective and work across countries, that kind of change will be a significant change that will help SMEs get involved in the value chain. Another one has to do with the whole issue of rules of origin. And I've seen this in practical terms where recently I was dealing with an SME which has actually now gone beyond SMEs and is already exporting to 7 African countries, had no idea about the fact that if it increases its inputs or if actually documented its inputs on how it sources its materials, and it's an FMCG company, it can more than meet the 60% protocol and then be able to take advantage of the guided trade and then be able to work with governments in this regard. So that's one of the things that I think need to happen. I mean, for want of time, let me give an example of one other significant change we can make, particularly for SMEs. Now, and again, I go back to the first speaker's sentiments. One of the things we fail to recognize that the typical African SMEs is unable to participate in intra-Africa trade because of lack of skill. And there are several reasons for that lack of skill. But the tool for aggregation and consolidation is such a massive tool that can be used and has been used in other regions to get SMEs to be able to aggregate their products and to be able to meet the skill without necessarily having to upskill, provided they can upgrade. Now, how you can do that through legislative changes and policy changes is to recognize consolidation and aggregation within municipal laws as the basis by which parties can participate under either the guided trade or the AfCFTA generally. And indeed, incidentally, there are a lot of funding available, including funding from AfriExim, where export credit facilities, canaling agencies, etc., who are able to consolidate cargo, are able to then be able to guarantee and underwrite SMEs in terms of the ability to supply at scale. Again, let me emphasize, without necessarily scaling. So for me, these are practical ways that we can use both what is existing and what we can change through policy and legislation across the continent to get SMEs involved in intra-Africa trade almost immediately. And these will be my recommendations for now.
And what is quite clear here is we shouldn't think of a blanket approach.
Exactly.
First, exactly. So let us look at who would rather strengthen someone who's at another level, and rather than saying that one size fits all.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be one of the key engagements we try to look at in the next discussion. Ms. Bridget Harrington, you're the final panelist in the round one. So as CEO of one of the first after authorized trading companies to ship value-added agricultural products under the agreement, how has AfTA transformed opportunities for SMEs in your perspective? And how do you identify and select small manufacturers with great products that meet international standards? Mrs. Bridget, you have the floor.
It's Bridget Harrington, and I want to thank you. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. There's been so much information that has been imparted here today that while I really want to answer the questions that you put forth, I think probably what would be better would be for me to respond what has been said since I'm the last speaker. Tamara, I want to thank you because one of the things that we look at when we select products from micro-size and small businesses is quality, labeling, packaging. So you're correct. The misnomer that if the product is made in Africa, that it's not as good as the West is alive and well. And so what we attempt to do is we change this. We're working on changing the narrative that's surrounding African products. And the way that we can do that is by ensuring that all products meet international standards. So in our selection process, and I probably should go back by saying that I'm the CEO of Uganda Continental Trading Company. And we are amongst one of the first companies that was authorized, selected by our Ministry of Trade here in Rwanda and authorized by AfCFTA. There are currently I believe there's 8 of these companies that operate within 6 countries across the continent. And our sole purpose for being in existence is to aggregate and consolidate products from micro-sized, small, and medium companies for the express purpose of introducing those products into new markets and also for penetrating those markets with those products. And so basically what that means, for example, is I would like to say, have somewhat of a bilateral relationship happening with Ghana right now. So as it stands right now, we consolidate 6 different products that are created in Africa, or created specifically here in Rwanda, which include 2 brands of coffee, tea, honey, avocado oil, and shea butter and shea oil. And we aggregate and consolidate these products from 6 different manufacturers or 6 different producers into one shipment under the AfCFTA trading company. And then we ship those products to Ghana. Once they're in Ghana, we distribute through an e-commerce platform. In the meantime, we're importing 4 products that have been aggregated and consolidated in Ghana here into this market, which include cocoa powder, chocolate bars, and chocolate bits, along with jam, fresh fruit jam for breakfast in the morning, and cocoa juice. And those products, once we import them here under the trading company, we then distribute through our 2 supermarket chains here, which are Sawa City and Simba. So this is how we are participating in AfCFTA as a trading company. So in that vein, I would like to say a couple of things. Number one, I think it's very imperative that everyone stay in their lane. Because if you are a small producer and let's say like the lady that produces our jam and she puts it in the jar, to now ask her to go figure out how to get a certificate of origin under AfCFTA and put a shipment together and ship it to another country, let's let her stay in the lane that she's in. And let's let those of us who are doing what we do take these products, because it allows her to export her products without directly having to take on the burden of it. I think I've gone over how we select the companies that whose products that we're going to either receive or to export. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about, which I think you asked me, is about sending and receiving payments in local currency. And this is something that is imperative that we start doing immediately. And so AfriExim Bank came up with an organization called PAPS, the Pan-African Payment Settlement System. And what that's supposed to do is it's supposed to connect all of the central banks throughout Africa so that I can sit here in Rwanda and send dirham to Morocco. Well, they're still working on it. It's operational in West Africa, but it's operational nowhere else. So what I would like to pose to the audience today who's listening is that there is a workaround this. You know, when you look at some of the other banks that we have, who 9 times out of 10, most of you bank with, I'd like to refer you to EcoBank that has a presence in 36 African countries, which includes, I believe they're in West, Central, East, and Southern Africa. We can look at Stanbic Bank or Standard Bank, which has a presence in 20 countries. UBA has a presence in 20 countries. Bank of Africa has a presence in 19 countries. Access Bank has a presence in 13 countries. And there are a few other ones that have less of a presence. Why is this important? I personally bank with EcoBank. I'm not advertising them, but because they have a presence in 36 countries, what it does is it allows me to receive a transfer or to make a transfer in less than 5 minutes in local currency. There are no SWIFT fees, there's no corresponding bank fees, and there's no incoming wire fees associated with a commission. The cost of the transfer is generally 1% of the transfer amount, and this does not contribute to the devaluation of the local currency. So in other words, when I'm doing business in Ghana and when a customer has to send me money or I have to send them money, I can actually go on my phone if I don't have my computer, go to the app and say, I need to transfer X amount of CDs. Now, I'm going to transfer from my local currency, which is Rwandan francs. So I'll have to put the approximate amount in there until I get to the CD value. Once I've gotten to the CD value, I accept it and I say, yes, this is what I want to do. Now, once I have done that, then I go through the normal channels of authenticating the actual transfer, which include they have to send me an OTP number to my phone or to my email. Once I receive that, I put I think it's a 4-digit or a 6-digit code. I don't remember. It's a 6-digit code. I put that in. Once that comes back, it says, okay, now we need to ask you these personal questions. What's the name of your grandmother? What's your mother's last name? Whatever. I put that information in. As soon as I hit enter, that money leaves my account, and in less than 5 minutes, it's in the intended company's account. So if the question is, why is it beneficial to make payment in local currency? I think I've given them to you. There are 4 specific reasons, and I'll repeat it. The transfer can be effected in less than 5 minutes. There's no SWIFT fees, no corresponding bank fees, no incoming wire fees, no commission. And the cost of the transfer is generally 1% of the transfer amount. And in addition to that, it does not contribute to the devaluation of the local currency in the international market.
Thank you very much.
I hope that I have covered everything.
No, you've done it very well, and that sets the tone to Mr. Kasi. So, Mr. Kasi, I think what you're going to do is kindly respond to your 2 questions briefly, and then we try to go to the final round for the other 4. So the question was, given your experience leading Centenary Bank in Uganda, a key player in our ecosystem here, what innovative financial models can African banks adopt to bridge the funding gaps for SMEs? And now, looking at the fact that Madame Brigitte has mentioned different banks in Africa, so that could be something to leverage on as well. Then, of course, the other one is as a bank which pioneered mobile banking, the Center Mobile, to reach underserved communities. How can digital financial tools be leveraged to help SMEs overcome trade barriers and participate more effectively in cross-border supply chains? Kindly take the floor. 4 minutes, let's see what you have, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Very well, sir. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I'm sorry there was a glitch at the very start, but as you've already mentioned, I work with the Centenary Bank, which has been operating in Uganda for the last 40 years. And, proud for having transformed quite a number of lives, especially SMEs, because that is the central, thing in the vision and in the mission of the bank, finding and facilitating trade for such institutions, which were previously left out of the banking space. As we speak now, the Centenary Bank serves the biggest number of customers in the country. Almost a quarter of all the people that bank with the commercial banks bank with the Centenary Bank. And when it comes to lending, we are now lending to over 250,000 SMEs or enterprises in the country. So, and when we talk about the balance sheet strength, we have over 7.4 trillion Uganda shillings, which is about 2 billion, US dollars, which is the second biggest in the country. So there's quite a bit of impact and contribution to funding SMEs. And when you talk about what innovative methods can be adopted, first of all, we realize that SMEs don't have the security or collateral for them to be able to access the funding that they need. Secondly, they will need long-term funding, which possibly not so many commercial banks will be able to avail. So what we've done is, first of all, is to try to find a way of reducing risk or de-risking these SMEs. And this we've been able to do in partnership with other institutions. We've been working with the other social, investors, social funders. We have institutions like ABI Trust, which is an organization that helps to de-risk, how we lend to these institutions, so that even if they don't have security, they are guaranteed by institutions like ABI Trust. They used to be guaranteed by USAID as well, and other institutions. And these are partnerships that we've been able to cultivate as a means of facilitating and enabling financial institutions to fund these SMEs. The other thing is because commercial banks like us are lending from depositors, which are typically short-term, what we do is to try to partner with other development banks like EFDB, East Africa Development Bank, Africa Development Bank, EIB, European Investment Bank, who are in position to avail, long-term funds that we can pass on to these institutions, these SMEs, to be able to fund and meet their long-term needs as far as funding is concerned. So those are some of the innovations, and we continue to do this, and that's how we've been able to see the number of SMEs that we are funding increasing. Talking about mobile banking, currently we have over 1 million customers that are connected to our mobile banking platform. What it has done is to enable customers, including the owners of these SMEs, to be able to transact from wherever they may be without necessarily coming to our banking halls. We have the biggest branch network in the country, currently at 82 and growing, but we also have the biggest agent network, whereby SMEs are able to reach out to agents that may be closer to them. But most importantly is to use the technology that we've availed through mobile phones to be able to transact so many ways. If it is transferring money to whoever is wherever, they are able to do that. If it is making payments to another person who may not be necessarily banking with us, but has a wallet, say a mobile wallet, money can be transferred to that wallet. So these are all some of the things that we are trying to use to be able to use technology to facilitate trade, to facilitate banking, and to facilitating business for these SMEs. Thank you. We can't hear you now.
I'm going to go to Mr. Salem, and your second question or input would be, what innovative financing mechanisms or tools has the SME Finance Forum identified or developed to help SMEs overcome financial barriers and participate more effectively in regional value chains? And I'm just looking from the perspective that money being available for grabs is one thing, but accessing that money is the other drama. So maybe take us through, sir, as also you wrap up. Yeah, so thank you.
Sure, I'll be brief in the interest of time. So some of the leading things we are seeing, the biggest issue in the SME financing world is absence of trust. And I think and access to trusted data and trusted resources. So I think we are seeing an emergence of universal trusted credentials and global legal identifiers, which basically leverages alternate data so you can create trust scores that allows you to trade internationally. And we've seen something like this being piloted in Ghana. We're working with the UNDP and Monetary Authority of Singapore and some other partners. So that's emergence of one area. And I think if you can solve the trust issue, we can solve a lot of issues. The second thing we are seeing is tokenization and blockchain in accessing the deep tier. SMEs don't sit in the tier one. SMEs are not suppliers of Nestle and Puma. They are in the deep tier. And to get to the deep tier, you have to use tokenization and blockchain technologies. And we've seen one of our members in China who's now expanding into Africa, who's done this successfully in China. And we're seeing some of the Mexican players also coming into this. So tokenization and deep tier supply chain finance is the second. The third aspect we are seeing is the embedded finance. Embedded finance could occupy as big as 26% share of the SME finance market in the next 3 to 5 years. So embedded finance links into value chains, links into the e-commerce. And we see that as one of the leading trends. Then, of course, alternate data uses and AI engines around it, analytical tools. I think that's another, our last conference focused on AI, and AI in value chains is becoming much more promising and prominent. Then electronic invoicing and supply chain finance platforms. There's practically a new supply chain finance platform born every week, and electronic invoicing is increasingly being adopted. That creates, ease of financing for SMEs. So electronic invoicing I see emerging in Africa, whereas in Asia and some other parts, Europe specifically, it has already progressed very well. Sustainability in supply chains is an area that we will need to keep watching. I think the need to make value chain sustainable will remain prominent. So these are some of the leading indicators that we are seeing in innovations. And of course, there are from instruments perspective, like IFC has risk sharing instruments. We have catalytical first loss, which we'll be launching very soon for Africa, which will give risk coverage, especially for institutions focusing on climate, agri, and gender. We have also, IFC has a global trade and supply chain finance platforms, which is $1 billion facility. And we've also been running a global supply chain finance program for years. So I think we also have risk sharing in addition to funding mechanisms that are coming into play. So thank you so much. I think we have a promising time ahead.
Thank you so much. I think I need to apologize to my other panelists, but let's be flexible. We're going to go into the Q&A, and strategically, when a question is posed to you, be innovative enough to try to tap onto what you're supposed to handle in the second bit, but in a summarized manner. So I will request Miali to kind of like open the Q&A session. And as the panelists respond to the particular questions that are going to be asked by the audience, just be innovative enough to try and tap onto what you feel the next question should have actually informed part of your response, just in an innovative way, such that we don't leave any table unturned. So the floor is open for Q&A. Miali, I think you'll lead that space as we,
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. So yeah, the Q&A box has been quite animated. Thank you so much for your active participation. So we have a question from Christiana G to Bridget. She wants to ask how the PAPSS is working, understanding that there are restrictions with the limit or threshold to the amount you can transact in, and is there any update on that? Over to you, Bridget.
Bridget. So PAPS is working between, the last I heard, Ghana and Nigeria and a few other West African countries. It's not working anywhere else in Africa. And so this is why it was so important for me to list the other large banks that have a footprint within Africa. And if you are a member of any one of those banks, I would suggest that you talk to them about intra-Africa trade and about being able to send local currency from your bank to perhaps another bank of a customer that has maybe a bank in the that bank with the same company in another country, to see if that's possible. I know personally that it is possible through EcoBank. I also know that someone also put a message in the chat box saying that they thought that EcoBank was part of PAPS. Well, EcoBank signed up to be part of PAPS, but the intra-Africa transfer has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with PAPS. It's called rapid transfer. And it's a feature that's offered by their bank, which is why I have a banking relationship with them because I could not find that feature at another bank.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. I think we can take another last question, and this one might be for Mr. Ofosu Dorde and maybe also Mr. Mode. So Tina Razafnjakut is asking what measures or recommendations are in place for SMEs integration in regional value and supply chains, especially for the case of African island states.
Come again, can you repeat the question?
So she's asking what measures or recommendations are in place for SMEs integration in regional value and supply chains, especially for the case of African island states.
Okay, I think in my first presentation, I mentioned the need for policy measures within the countries to ensure that SMEs get integrated. And that's when I drew the example about consolidation and aggregation, which Bridget has really elaborated on very much. But before I come back to that, I think it's important to comment on the PAPS question. I'm a big fan of PAPS, and I agree that as much as possible, you should work throughout Africa because it will really help SMEs, the ability to sell instantly and get the money back instantly. But the reason I come back to this PAPS issue is it relates to the fact that SMEs should lobby their governments for them to be very proactive in policy decisions. If you look at PAPS as it is structured, central banks are to become enablers for it to work throughout. But somehow, because the central banks in Africa, who together control over $500 billion of funds within the continent, because they've not been proactive in making it a national policy, PAPS have had to deal directly with individual banks as well, which is why some banks have signed on individually. Whilst it could have been better if it was a national policy for central banks to say every bank within this jurisdiction should make sure you are signed on to PAPS. So those are some of the things that I think we need to be lobbying for. Having said that, to get the SMEs properly integrated into the system, apart from what I said earlier, I think it's important for SMEs to put pressure on their governments to deal with the non-trade barriers. I mean, there are quite a number of them. And we keep talking about them, we keep having studies, a lot of them have been elaborated here. But if you had 2-3 governments come together and solve it across the border, that is when you can use all other measures that will then stimulate the trade across the barriers. Let me give an example of the value chain corridors. Already the trade is occurring. If you even use, whether you use 16%, which is the average, or use 59%, which you may have in East Africa, it simply means people are trading between South Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, which is why LAPSET as a project becomes relevant. Similarly, people are trading between Ghana, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and Nigeria, which is why Abidjan-Lagos corridor becomes relevant. Then you will find that simply as a result of SME trading among themselves, there is a larger infrastructure project where you can add PPPs to structure a $16 billion project on the Abidjan-Lagos corridor. That is how these things work. So to integrate SME much more into the space, one, I would recommend the push for what has been called in some countries industrial subcontracting, which is simply a policy measure where big corporates who are actually exporting have to show as part of their rules of origin which SMEs in the continent they are actually subcontracting input supplies to. Again, I go back to Bridget. It means you are exporting without necessarily being an exporter. Second is a consolidation aggregation. The other one that we don't use at all is franchising. It appears all SMEs believe that they must necessarily open branches in order to be able to. When you can actually enter into franchising arrangements and still have your products recognized across the continent, and again, these are policies that I think we should encourage. So once we do this, Then the bigger ones about cross-border energy, cross-border infrastructure, and even cross-border special economic zones can become relevant. I will make a last point before I pause there. We don't have to see AfCFTA as an isolated policy. For example, under the Africa Mining Vision, where we are all crying about adding value to minerals, between Liberia and Guinea, it's simply the Nimba Bounty Mountain where iron ore straddles across the two countries. It is possible to create a downstream iron fabrication industry, which is PPP based, which is across the border, which will attract enough funding, and which, based on the back of all other things, will enhance SME value chain into it once the standards are harmonized. So these are some of the things I think we should be doing to enhance SME role in the bigger AfCFTA picture.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ofosu-Orteh. I think we've exceeded by 5 minutes already our allocated time for this session. So I will give you the floor, Patrick, to wrap up, summarize the idea of a session, and then I will kindly ask Mr. Simon Peter from the Uganda RCO to give the final words of thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Miali, and to my panelists, thank you very much for the input, and the distinguished participants. The entire audience has been great, and those who asked their questions, some who posted this, and I believe I would propose that UNCTAD could make a provision where if they could access the communication trails, and then maybe share with the participants, if anyone has a question to any of the panelists, they can still be able to get to communicate that. But in summary, just starting from what Council David has actually said, I think some of the key learnings here is, number one, this whole mentality of trust is still an issue. Africans, we don't seem to trust each other. You don't believe that someone can actually do something in a much better way than you, so you decide, I can do it myself. So there's so much of reinvention of the wheel when actually through strategic partnership, work can be achieved and have bigger output. That's number one. Then the issues of harmonization of standards. What is very key here is market access is one thing, but meeting the market entry conditions is another thing. And it becomes such a critical issue because once governments say, I'll give you a case in point for Uganda's case, as we summarize this. We got a government-to-government arrangement to supply milk to Algeria. And Uganda promised that we can actually raise 500 metric tons of milk per year. That's not the issue. But the issue was when reality checked in, can you meet those volumes? It turned out that also the standards that are being applied in the Algerian market are totally different from what our dairy farmers and the entrepreneurs are affiliated to. So at the end of the day, you hit a wall. The third, I just want to look at the fact that this whole talk about value chains, it should be articulated in the manner that you are not, a value chain is each person identifying his specific role, playing it, optimizing it, and feeding into the chain. So that's why not every MSME should actually try to do international trade. They could play the input role, feed into the bigger company gets this, and they're able to trade volumes. The issue of, I think, the cooperative movements in different countries in Africa should actually be encouraged, because what hampers most of the ability to export is to meet volumes that the export market requires. Then I think financing could be available, but accessibility is still a challenge. So SMEs are not able to get this financing as much as because from what Mr. Salem said, there's so much opportunities to address the current financing gap for MSMEs. But the drama is, Mr. Salem, this money is not easily accessible. Then looking at leveraging on technology, Mr. Kasi, you made it clearly what is happening in the Ugandan ecosystem. If that's the case, then that calls for actually partnership between when financial institutions are able to partner, then they can actually have that bit where they can actually share solutions to be able to expand on the market and meet the dynamics needs of the different clients. But the other thing is on a policy. Policy came out clear because at the end of the day, if the respective countries within the AfCFTA arrangement are not aligned, then that means each person is still working their own way. So I think policy to be synchronized is going to make a big difference. Then I think aspects of standards are critical. And especially if you're going into any product related kind of like trading or commodities, each product has got its own standards and specifications. So this calls for entities like Africa Regional Standards Organization, ASO, and the respective standard organizations in Africa to actually have a closer network on how best this could be a reality. Because we anticipate where a product in Uganda should actually go to Mali, and it doesn't need really to go through some rigorous testing again, because there's that kind of arrangement between the different parties. And I think also, last but not least, I would think capacity building for MSMEs still remains something that we need to focus on and support these guys moving forward. And last but not least, from Ms. Tamara's Egbedi experience, I think for entrepreneurs, if you design solutions that are aligned to government priorities, trust me, your government will reach out to you. Will reach out to you, align it to the national development agenda, the regional development agenda, the continental development agenda, the global agenda, because all these plans are aligned in that regard. And I think that should actually be the case for us to move forward. Thank you very much. And merely, I hand over the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Mr. Simon Peter Serico, you have the floor, but I have an announcement. I've been told to take a group picture. So after Mr. Serico's remark, everyone please put on your camera so that we can see your face, and then I will snap quick pictures of all of us. Over to you, Simon Peter.
Thank you, Miali. I hope everyone can hear me clearly.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm unable to show my video because of a technical challenge. It shows my picture upside down. I don't know why, but I'm so grateful to the team from UNCTAD and the Ministry of Trade for the opportunity to give closing remarks and say a word of thanks to the team. First of all, I wish to extend my appreciation to the participants because this event would not have been a success without this overwhelming participation. At some point, we were not sure that we'll get the numbers because this is a fully virtual event. But when I checked, I saw that we had about 70 participants. So we really appreciate your commitment to the importance of this conversation. But again, the panelists, we've had a very practical panel, very insightful conversations. For some of us who are involved in policy support, the insights from this discussion are going to continue influencing our engagements with government, but also other stakeholders in terms of the policy and legal aspects that need to be transformed in order to facilitate trade on the continent. I also wish to thank the government of Uganda. I think it's very important for us to recognize the commitment of the government of Uganda through the Ministry of Trade for your leadership, because Uganda is the host of this Africa Regional Forum on Sustainable Development. So your leadership as the ministry in driving this side event is greatly appreciated. But also colleagues from UNCTAD, we've had a good working relationship throughout the process of preparing for this side event. So Junior Davis, we've had we've worked very well with your team, together with the team at the Ministry of Trade. My name remains Simon Peter Nsereko. I am the economist here in Uganda at the United Nations Resident Coordinator's Office. I also wish to use this opportunity to mention that this project is still ongoing and there's a lot more to come. So expect to hear from us, especially from the countries that are implementing this project spearheaded by UNCTAD. So I know we do not have a lot of time. I wish to give back the floor to Miali. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon Peter. So I will quickly take a few pictures before closing the meeting. So please turn on the camera and smile. Yeah, few more. Keep smiling, everyone. Okay. We have a lot of participants, so I'm trying to go over the pages. One last picture. Yes, that will be it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.